The first thing I heard was the sound that always broke the fragile peace of our woods. A sharp, female cry that was not the call of a hawk or a fox, but the sound of my wife, Sarah, shouting, "Get off our property." It was followed by a man's low, mocking laughter, a sound that made the fine hairs on my arms stand up. The second thing I saw, as I rounded the corner of the old, moss-covered woodshed, was the crimson stain blossoming on the front of my wife's. A simple white t-shirt, a grotesque, terrible flower blooming in the space just below her collarbone. The third thing I saw was the man who had put it there. He was one of the 2 compliance enforcers from the new Lakeside Preserve Homeowners Association. Thick, brutish man with a shaved head and the cruel, dead-eyed smirk of a predator who enjoys his work. He was standing over my wife, Sarah, who was on her knees in her own sun-drenched garden, gasping for breath, her hand clutching her chest where he had just viciously backhanded her. The smirk on his face was one of triumph, the look of a bully who had finally gotten the reaction he'd been trying to provoke for months. My world, which had been a quiet, fragile thing I had painstakingly and desperately rebuilt since coming home from the war, went completely, utterly silent. The chirping of the birds, the rustling of the leaves in the tall Georgia pines, the distant, lazy hum of a boat on the lake, it all vanished, replaced by a low, rushing sound in my ears. It was the sound of a storm gathering force, the sound of a caged door groaning on its hinges. The man saw me then. His smirk widened, a flash of yellowed teeth. "Look what we have here," he said to his partner, a smaller, weaselly man who was standing by our property line, holding a clipboard like a shield. "It's the man of the house. Your wife here was being uncooperative, a little hysterical. Actually, refused to accept the final notice to join the association. You people need to learn some respect for the rules of the community." He took a step toward me, puffing out his chest, rolling his thick shoulders. He thought I was just a quiet, reclusive man who lived in an old cabin, a man who hid from the world. He thought the scars I carried were all on the inside. He had no way of knowing that the quiet I so desperately cultivated was not a weakness, but a cage I had built around a part of myself I never, ever wanted to let out again. And he had just kicked the door clean off its hinges. In that moment, he wasn't an HOA enforcer anymore. He wasn't a neighbor, wasn't even a man. He was just a target, a threat to be neutralized. And I was no longer a husband, a gardener, or a homeowner. I was what the United States Army Special Forces had spent 15 years and millions of dollars to create, a weapon system. Fully activated and directed, Sarah and I had moved to this cabin 6 months ago, seeking refuge. I had come home from my final tour in Afghanistan 2 years prior, carrying a constellation of scars, both visible on my skin and invisible, but far deeper in my soul. After 15 years as a Green Beret, operating in the darkest corners of the world, the quiet, predictable civilian world I had left behind felt alien and hostile. Every loud noise was a potential IED, its echo a ghost of an explosion. Every crowded room was a tactical problem with too many variables, too many potential threats. I was diagnosed with a severe case of post-traumatic stress disorder. My peace was a fragile, slippery thing, a butterfly that landed on my shoulder only in moments of profound quiet, ready to flee at the slightest disturbance. Sarah, a brilliant and compassionate botanist, was my anchor to this world. She was the one who could talk me down from the midnight panics, the one whose quiet, steady presence could soothe the jagged, razor-sharp edges of my memory. We decided to leave the city, to find a place where the silence was real, where I could heal, where the only sounds were the ones nature made. This cabin was our dream. It was an old, beautiful structure on 10 acres of private wooded land. With its own small stretch of shoreline on a quiet lake, it was a pre-existing property, legally and geographically separate from the new, sprawling lakeside preserve development that had consumed the rest of the shoreline. Our lawyer had confirmed its ironclad sovereign status. We were not part of their HOA. We were an island, a sanctuary. The problem was, our sanctuary ruined their perfect uniform view. The HOA, led by a notoriously aggressive president named Mr. Hayes, could not stand the sight of our rustic, non-compliant cabin and its wild natural landscape. Our refusal to join their association, To submit to their endless rules about lawn height and mailbox color and the precise shade of one's roof shingles was a personal affront to their authority. Their campaign of harassment started with the usual petty tactics: fines for our unapproved gravel driveway, warnings about our overgrown native plant garden, which was, in fact, Sarah's professional passion, a carefully curated collection of rare local flora. We ignored them, sending back a single polite letter from our lawyer explaining our property's exempt status and kindly telling them to leave us alone. When the letters failed, Hayes escalated. He had amended the HOA bylaws to create a new Taman Compliance Enforcement Division. He had hired 2 thugs, men with security guard uniforms and the cold, dead eyes of bullies, to patrol the community and enforce the rules. Their primary mission, it became clear, was to make our lives a living hell. They would park their golf cart at the edge of our property for hours, just watching a silent, intimidating presence. They would follow Sarah when she went for a walk. Down the public county road that led to our driveway, they left threatening, unsigned notes in our mailbox, filled with crude warnings. It was a campaign of low-grade psychological warfare designed to wear us down, to make us feel so unsafe in our own home that we would either submit and join or sell the property to the HOA, which had made several unsolicited, insulting, lowball offers. I had handled it all with the rigid, practiced calm I had learned in the service. I documented everything. I installed a state-of-the-art security system with multiple cameras. I did not engage. To engage would be to lose the very control I fought every single day to maintain. My rage, the rage I had learned to channel and focus on the battlefield, was a beast I had to keep locked away. Sarah had pleaded with me to let the sheriff handle it, and I had agreed. Though the effort it took to not respond to their daily provocations was a physical strain, a constant, grinding pressure, which brought us to today. I had been in the back woods, clearing a new walking path for Sarah, the rhythmic work a kind of therapy. The 2 enforcers had used that opportunity to trespass on our land, to confront my wife in her garden. And when she had, as we had agreed, refused to accept their final notice, the larger of the 2 had struck her. He had put his hands on my wife. The world was still silent, still moving in a strange, syrupy, slow motion.
How my perception
narrowed. The smaller man with the clipboard, the weasel, was starting to look nervous. He could see the change in me. The bigger man, however, was still puffed up with the cheap, borrowed power of his uniform. "What's the matter, buddy?" he sneered, taking another step toward me. "Cat, got your tongue? Or are you just some coward who lets his little woman fight his battles for him?" He had crossed the invisible line, the 10-foot perimeter that my training had etched into the deepest parts of my brain. He was now a hostile combatant within my immediate sphere of influence. My body moved without any conscious thought for me, a complex machine executing a program it had run 1,000 times before. The cage door was open. The beast was out. The sequence of events that followed took less than 5 seconds. A brutal, efficient, and utterly final ballet of controlled violence. My movements were not born of the red mist of anger, but of something far older and more deeply ingrained. Thousands of hours of hand-to-hand combat training. Honed in the deadliest, most unforgiving environments on Earth, it was pure. Instinctual muscle memory, the grim and terrible art of human geometry. The big man, the one who had hit my wife, was still sneering. He was in the middle of saying something. His mouth opened to spit another taunt when I closed the distance between us in 2 fluid, silent strides. His brain was still formulating a thought while my body was already executing a solution. My left hand shot out, not in a clumsy, telegraphed punch, but with a stiff, open palm, the heel of my hand striking the base of his nose. The technique is not about power. It's about hydraulic shock, a precise jolt that travels directly up the cartilaginous septum to the brainstem, causing a momentary, system-wide shutdown of the central nervous system. His eyes went wide, with a look of pure, uncomprehending shock as his world went instantly dark. Before his massive body had even begun its slow, crumpling fall to the grass, I was already pivoting, my focus shifting to the second threat. The smaller man with the clipboard, the weasel, was just beginning to register what was happening. His mouth was open in a silent O of abject terror. He made a fatal mistake. He dropped his clipboard and tried to turn and run. His panic made him slow and clumsy. I caught the collar of his polo shirt, using his own forward momentum to spin him around and slam him face first into the thick, unforgiving trunk of a nearby oak tree. There was a sickening, wet crunch as his nose and cheekbone broke against the rough bark. He slid to the ground in a heap, a whimpering, bloody mess. The clipboard and its meaningless violation notices scattering in the grass around him like fallen leaves. The silence that rushed back in was absolute, profound. It was broken only by the whimpering of the man by the tree and the ragged, harsh sound of my own breathing. I stood between the two crumpled forms, my body still coiled, my senses on high alert, my head on a swivel, scanning for other threats as my training dictated. But there were none. The battle was over. It was Sarah's voice that brought me back from that cold, hard place. "John," she whispered, her voice hoarse and shaky. She was on her feet now, her hand still pressed to her chest where the bruise was already starting to form, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. She wasn't afraid of me. She was afraid for me, afraid of the place in his own mind that she knew I had just been forced to go. I turned to her, and the cold, hard mask of the soldier fell away, replaced by the panicked, desperate face of a husband. I rushed to her side, my hands hovering over her, afraid to touch her, afraid that the same hands that had just wrought such efficient destruction might somehow break her. "Are you okay?" "Did he God? Sarah, I'm so sorry you had to see that." "Okay," she said, her voice shaky but firm as she took my trembling hand in hers. "He just knocked the wind out of me." "John, what did you do?" "I kept a promise," I said, my voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. I would never let anyone hurt you. Now, go inside. Lock the doors. And call 911. Tell them your husband has been assaulted by 2 men on your property, and that you require police and an ambulance immediately." She understood immediately. She was a calm head in a crisis. The narrative had to be clear, precise, and truthful. They were the aggressors. They were the ones who had trespassed and initiated the physical contact. My response, however brutal, had been a reaction. Defense of my wife and my home. The arrival of the sheriff's deputies was a scene of controlled, surreal calm. They found me sitting on my porch steps, my hands resting openly on my knees, my breathing even and slow. They found Sarah inside, a bag of frozen peas pressed to her rapidly bruising chest. And they found the 2 compliance enforcers exactly where they had fallen. The big one was just beginning to stir, a low, piteous groan escaping his lips. The smaller one was sobbing quietly into a patch of moss. I explained what had happened in a calm, flat, declarative monotone, the same way I would have delivered an after-action report to a commanding officer. I detailed the months of harassment. I explained that the 2 men had trespassed on our posted property. I explained that they had verbally and then physically assaulted my wife. I explained that I had then acted to defend her from the ongoing assault. The big man, conscious and belligerent, tried to spin his own story from the back of the ambulance. "He's a maniac," he yelled, his voice thick from his broken nose. "We were just serving a notice and he attacked us. It's out of nowhere, for no reason." But the evidence was hard to argue with. There was the rapidly forming hand-shaped bruise on my wife's chest. There were the scattered HOA notices on the grass, proof that this was not a random encounter. And there was my own state-of-the-art security camera footage, which I had calmly downloaded to my tablet and now presented to the lead deputy. The footage was high definition and undeniable. It showed the 2 men walking onto our property. It showed them confronting Sarah in her garden. It showed the big man shouting, then striking her with the back of his hand with vicious force. And it showed me, coming around the woodshed and neutralizing the 2 of them in a blur of motion that lasted less than 5 seconds. The lead deputy, a veteran officer with tired eyes, watched the footage, his face grim. He had seen enough. 2 enforcers were handcuffed, and after being treated at the hospital, booked into the county jail. They were charged with trespassing, assault, and battery. The fallout for the Lakeside Preserve HOA was catastrophic. When the story came out, when it was revealed that their president, Mr. Hayes, had hired 2 thugs with criminal records to act as his private army and that they had assaulted a woman on her own property, the community erupted in fury and lawsuits. Hayes was immediately removed as president. The HOA's insurance carrier dropped them instantly, citing the hiring of unlicensed and unbonded security personnel who had committed felonies while on the job. They were facing a massive multi-million-dollar lawsuit from us and dozens more from their own residents, whose property values were now plummeting due to the scandal. A week later, our lawyer informed us that the HOA had agreed to settle. They offered us a 7-figure sum, a formal, public apology to be printed in the local paper, and a legally binding covenant to be filed with the county that acknowledged our property's sovereign status and created a permanent 50-foot no-contact buffer zone around our land. We accepted. That evening, I was sitting on the dock with Sarah, watching the sunset paint the lake in fiery strokes of orange and gold. The bruise on her chest had faded to a sickly yellow-green, but the fear in her eyes from that day was finally, blessedly, gone. The silence of the lake was no longer a fragile thing I had to fight to protect. It was ours again, solid and real. You know, she said softly, leaning her head on my shoulder, I've never seen that part of you before, not really. I hope you never have to see it again, I said, my voice thick with emotion. I keep it locked away for a reason. I know, she whispered, her hand finding mine in the twilight. But I'm glad it's there. I'm glad it's on my side. I looked out across the dark, still water. The beast was back in its cage. The storm was over, and my world was quiet again. The price of our peace had been a few seconds of terrible violence. A brief, bloody reminder that the only way to truly defeat a bully is to meet their aggression with an absolute, unyielding, and overwhelming finality. They had made the fatal mistake of breaking their petty rules in a place where I had once been the master of a much deadlier game,